Have you ever heard the phrase pain in the neck or thorn in the flesh? This is actually a saying that is found in the Bible. If you're to be reading in the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 12, the Apostle Paul has been experiencing some kind of difficulty. We don't know for sure whether it was a physical pain or emotional or whatever kind of difficulty that was. But it was so bad that the Apostle Paul prays not once or twice, but 3 times for God to take away this pain or this thorn in the flesh. God's response is interesting. In 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9, he says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Rather than taking away this thorn in the flesh or pain in the neck for Paul, God chooses rather to give him enough grace to sustain him through this difficulty. Paul would continue to minister and to serve God in spite of the thorn in the flesh, but he would only be able to do so through the strength that would come through the grace of God. We have all been experiencing the effects of this global pandemic that we're experiencing locally in our families and our ministries, wherever we are. I know for my wife and I have been trying to figure out how we can continue to minister to our congregation, how we can continue to serve our community, how we could figure out homeschooling for our 3 boys, which is not an easy thing. But I know I need God's grace to sustain me. I need God's grace that is sufficient. As we watch the news, we hear about the concern that there may not be enough hospital beds, there may not be enough masks or ventilators, all these things, but we're not sure whether we have sufficient resources to meet the needs. But when we come to God, He promises us to have this grace that is enough, that is sufficient, that will sustain us through this challenge. Maybe in addition to praying for a cure or for a stop of the spread of this virus, you and I can join hands this morning, at least spiritually from a distance, and pray the same prayer to ask God to give us grace. His grace that is sufficient to sustain us through all of this. We may have questions whether we have enough of other resources, but we can be sure that we can find enough grace, sufficient grace that comes from God. And the beauty of it all is that the grace of God is never in short supply. It is not on back order. It is not limited to just the people that are wealthy or more spiritual. The grace of God is sufficient for all. So join me, join my family, join my congregation, join the Salvation Army movement and the churches really all the world over, praying for God's provision, God's protection, and God's healing. And from this moment on, let's also pray for God's grace. Another one of my favorite verses is Ephesians 3:20, where Paul also writes to the Ephesians to say, "Let us glorify God." Why? Because He's able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we could ever ask or think. A different translation would say, God is able to do immeasurably more than we could ask or imagine. That is how God is able to do. He can give us grace that is sufficient, and it's even more than enough, more than what we need. Pray for God's sufficient grace, sustaining grace today. Have a nice day.